Good morning, students. I am Dr. Pradeep Daniel, genius from the Department of Pediatric and Preventive Dentistry, Vinayaga Mission Sankaracharya Dental College. And today I will be talking on the topic of pediatric minor oral surgeries. So these are the contents of my seminar. We will be starting with the introduction, preoperative evaluation, simple exodontia, extraction of impacted teeth, lesions of newborn, natal and neonatal teeth, lesions of erupting dentition, abscess, erupting gingivitis, pericoronitis, mucocele, ranula, odontogenic cysts, maxillary frenectomy, ankyloglossia, apicoectomy, and we will be finishing with the conclusion. So surgery performed on pediatric patients generally involves a number of special considerations that is unique for this population. Behavioral guidance of children in the operative and preoperative periods presents a special challenge. Special attention should be given to the assessment of social, emotional and psychological status of the pediatric population prior to the surgery. So children, they have many unvoiced fears concerning the surgical experience, and their psychological management requires the dentist to be cognizant of their emotional status. So answering questions concerning to the surgery is important, and it should be done in the presence of the parent. The potential for adverse effects on growth from injuries and/or surgery in the oral and maxillofacial region markedly increases the risks and complications in the pediatric population. Injuries to the mandibular condyle result in restricted growth, and also it limits the mandibular function as a result of ankylosis. Surgery involving maxilla and mandible in young patients is complicated by the presence of developing tooth follicles. Alteration or deviation from the standard treatment modalities may be necessary to avoid damaging these follicles. So minor oral surgery is defined as a surgical procedure that can be comfortably done by a competent, non-specialized dental surgeon within 30 minutes under LA with or without sedation. So coming to preoperative evaluation, in the medical evaluation, we should obtain a thorough medical history, anticipating and preventing emergency situations and being prepared to treat emergency situations. In dental preoperative evaluation, it is very important to perform a thorough clinical and radiographic preoperative evaluation of the dentition as well as extraoral and intraoral soft tissues. To minimize the negative effects of surgery on the developing dentition, this is very much necessary. Moving on to the first topic, which is simple exodontia, that is nothing but a tooth extraction. It is the painless removal of entire tooth or tooth root with minimal trauma to the investing tissues so that the wound heals uneventfully without any postoperative problems. So what are the indications for a simple exodontia? So it is indicated in cases of badly carious tooth, retained primary teeth, infected periapical area that cannot be treated without extraction, in cases of orthodontic purposes, rudimentary supernumerary teeth which is found in a radiograph, in traumatic injury to teeth if vertical fractures occur, in cases of ankylosed primary teeth, impacted primary teeth, or ectopically positioned teeth which cannot be brought into function. So what are all the contraindications for a simple exodontia? So the contraindications can be divided into relative contraindications as well as absolute contraindications. So relative contraindications include the local factors such as acute infections like stomatitis, acute infections, hepatic stomatitis, acute perisymentitis, acute dentalveolar abscess, acute cellulitis, as well as any malignancy. In cases of systemic conditions, it may be acute or chronic rheumatic heart disease, congenital heart disease, kidney disease that requires a proper antibiotic coverage and consultation with a clinician. A child having bleeding disorders is attended to only after consultation with a hematologist. Patients with diabetes mellitus, the diet should be retained the same qualitative and quantitative composition after an extraction. And the absolute contraindications in which the treatment, that is the extraction, should not be done at all include hemangioma and arteriovenous fistula. Before moving on to extraction, it is necessary to know the differences between a primary teeth and a permanent teeth. So the primary teeth, when comparing the size of the two, it is very small in every dimension compared to the permanent teeth. Coming to this shape of the teeth, the crowns are more bulbous, and the furcation of the primary root is positioned more cervically when compared to the permanent teeth. Physiologically, the root of the primary tooth, it resorbs naturally, whereas the permanent teeth, the root doesn't resorb at all. And in case of supporting bone, the bone of the alveolus in case of primary teeth is much more elastic in the young patients. So with this in mind, there are many modifications which are done for the techniques as well as the instruments that are necessary for extraction of teeth in children. So the type of forceps, the beaks and handles are smaller to accommodate more bulbous crown than the beaks of the permanent teeth, and the beaks are more curved in forceps which is designed for the removal of the primary teeth. A widespread splaying of primary roots means that there is more expansion that is required in the socket when a tooth is to be removed. And due to relatively cervical position of the bifurcation in primary molars, it is injurious to use forceps with deep plunging beaks to engage the furcation area. We should also avoid blindly investigating the primary socket so that we don't injure the developing permanent tooth. Because of the physiological resorption, it is often preferable to leave small fragments of the root in case of any root fractures. So it is very much necessary to instruct the parent not to discuss with the child what the periodontist will do to them, as the parent's choice of words may be poor, which will unintentionally make the child more fearful. We should always reassure the parent that post-operative pain will not occur in case of primary tooth extraction. And in case of 8 to 10-year-old age group children, they adjust better for the extraction when they are told 4 to 7 days prior to the appointment. Whereas in cases of younger children, they should be told only during the day of the appointment. So before giving an LA, we should always explain to the child that the sensation of pinching of or biting of an ant will be felt, and we should never tell that there won't be any sort of pain during the injection. It is extremely important that the child realizes the difference between pressure and pain. So to do that, what we can do is we can check the anesthesia by placing an elevator on the gingival crevices and note the eye reaction of the child, because the child tends to not differentiate between the pressure and pain and cries throughout the procedure when they are experiencing even a slight pressure. Coming to the operator position, it is very important to maintain a proper operator position when you are extracting tooth of specific quadrants. So coming to the maxillary right quadrant, the operator should be in the front and to the side of the patient, and in case of maxillary left quadrant, the operator should be in the front of the patient and to the side. And in case of mandibular right, the operator should be towards the back of the patient, that is the 12 o'clock position, and to the side. And in case of mandibular left, the operator should be in the front and to the side. This is all for a right-handed person, and in case of a left-handed person, the mandibular right and the mandibular left will be the only thing which will be changing. So moving on to the non-working hand, it is very much important to utilize the non-working hand. Even though it is called as a non-working hand, it should be used as a support when doing an extraction. So it is used to retract the soft tissues to allow visibility and access, and it protects the tissues in case the instrument slips from the tooth. That is, it should protect the surrounding gingiva when the forceps are used to engage the tooth, so that the surrounding gingiva is not injured. It provides resistance to extraction forceps on the mandible to prevent dislocation, and it also provides a feel to the operator during the extraction and gives information for any sort of resistance during the removal of the tooth from the socket. So moving on to the forces during extraction. So in case of maxillary posteriors, because it has a curved palatal root, mild palatal force should be given, and then a single sustained force in the buccal direction, and the tooth is loosened, and a counterclockwise motion is used to deliver the tooth from the socket. In case of maxillary anteriors, the cross section of the root is more of a round structure. So the initial apical pressure is given, and then a slightly lingual pressure with a counterclockwise rotation will deliver the tooth from the socket. In case of mandibular posteriors, the cross section of the root is more flat mesiodistally, and it is also elliptical. Therefore, any rotary motion is usually contraindicated. And so an initial lingual force is given, then a sustained single force is given in the buccal direction until the tooth is loosened, and after loosening, a counterclockwise rotation delivers the tooth from the socket. In case of mandibular anteriors, the cross section of the root is oval, therefore no rotatory motion should be given initially. So an initial apical pressure is given, and the direction of the force which is applied is labial in a single sustained action. After the tooth is loosened, a counterclockwise motion delivers the tooth from the socket. So once we complete the extraction procedure, it is necessary to give proper post-operative instructions to the patient. So the patient is made to sit in the dental chair till a blood clot is formed, and when you are changing the blood clot in case of children, when we are changing the gauze pieces, it should be made sure that the gauze piece doesn't enter the sight of the child, as the child may become fearful. And the child is instructed not to bite his lips, as most of the cases, in cases of children, we give a field infiltration or a block infiltration which anesthetizes the soft tissues also. So once the soft tissue is anesthetized, in case the child bites onto the soft tissues, they won't feel any sensation of pain, but eventually it will lead to the formation of an ulcer. The child is also instructed not to disturb the area where the tooth is extracted, such that they should not use their tongue to explore that area. And they are also instructed not to rinse their mouth for 24 hours after extraction, and they should be instructed that when they are drinking juices, they should not use a straw and they can sip the juice. We should reinforce what has been already told to the child and make them repeat the same, so that we know that some of the instruction that we have given to them has entered their mind. A light meal with no hot food should be recommended for that same day. Analgesic is prescribed if extraction was traumatic, and antibiotic in case there is any infection. Other than that, you should never give an antibiotic coverage if there is no infections present at all. Blood can appear on the pillow in the next day or so. This shows that there is a slight oozing of blood from the healing socket, which is normal, and this gets mixed with the saliva to produce the image that there is a large amount of blood which has been let out from the cavity. Moving on to the second topic of extraction of impacted teeth. So what is an impacted teeth? Impacted teeth, which includes the supernumerary teeth, are teeth which are embedded into the bone and which do not erupt into the oral cavity. So impacted teeth are treated for children for several reasons, and they may be symptomatic. For example, the patient may have pain in that region. There is a sign of a radiographic sign of pathology. For example, a dentigerous cyst is developing in that impacted tooth, or in case of a orthodontic reason. So for example, if we are doing a orthodontic movement of the tooth, the presence of the supernumerary tooth may impede the tooth from moving. So during that stage, we can extract the impacted tooth. So when you are doing an extraction of an impacted tooth, it is very much necessary that a proper flap should be raised. So what should be a flap design be? So a flap design should be mucoperiosteal. It should cut 90 degree to the bone, and it should have a proper blood supply. And when we are doing a flap, we should make sure that we are avoiding damage to the important structures like the blood vessels and nerves, and we should allow atraumatic reflection, provide adequate access and visibility to this area, and permit reopposition over the wound margins over sound bone. There are many designs of flaps, in which a few of them will be explained here. So in the first design, we can see that there is a horizontal line which is engaging the gingival margin, and there is a vertical relief incision which is placed into the depth of the buccal sulcus. So when we are reflecting this area, we will be able to expose this site where the impacted tooth is present. Second design is the semilunar incision, where we are placing a half moon shaped incision that is at least 5 mm from the attached gingiva and should be maintained at the narrowest point to ensure that there is a good blood supply in this marginal gingiva. In case of flap design for a palatally or a lingually placed tooth, the palatally positioned teeth are best removed via incision that follows the palatal gingival margin. So for example, in this picture we can see a palatally impacted teeth. So a flap design is made so that it involves all the gingival margins of the palatal region of the teeth, and an incision is made such that it maintains the integrity of the crater-palatine nerve which flows in this region. In case of lower jaw, adequate access to the lingual side is obtained by raising the lingual gingiva and reflecting mucosa, which is by the incision running around the lingual gingival margin, which is similar to the other types of incisions. So once the flap has been raised, bone removal is done using hand instruments or by use of a rotary instrument. So hand instruments includes your chisel, which is given here. So and your rotary instruments include your use of your burrs with sufficient or a copious amount of saline irrigation. Tooth removal is done once sufficient bone has been removed, and which allows the identification of the impacted tooth. So the amount of bone removed should be sufficient that it should accommodate the greatest diameter of the impacted tooth, so that it could be recovered without damaging much to the surrounding structures. Once the tooth has been removed, a suturing is done so that it promotes healing. So as per all the procedures, there will be a few complications that might arise from removal of an impacted teeth. So what are all the complications that might arise? We have a post-extraction hemorrhage, which is continuous bleeding of the socket once the extraction is done. There may be an infection to the socket when the patient is not taking proper care of the oral hygiene. There may be a dry socket development, which might develop when the patient is not following the proper post-operative instructions that are given to them. There may be a pain or numbness, or also a referred pain might develop in some cases. Moving on to the next topic of lesions of newborn. So oral pathologies, it occurs even in newborn children, not just your children and adolescents. So in case of newborns, there are a few lesions that might occur. The most common ones are your Epstein pearls, dental lamina cyst, bones nodules, and your congenital epulis. So Epstein pearls, these are as shown in the picture, these are commonly found in about 75 to 80% of the newborns, and they occur in the along the median palatine raphe of the palate, which is a result of trapped epithelial remnants along the line of fusion of the palatal half. So here is the median palatal raphe of in the picture, and you can see a small lesion here, which is your Epstein pearls. The second lesion is your dental lamina cyst. These are found along the crest of the alveolar ridges and are most commonly seen bilaterally and in the region of, usually in the region of your first primary molar. So here is the alveolus of the lower arch, where you can see a round lesion. This is your dental lamina cyst. So this is a cystic lesion. You can see it is usually filled with fluid, and it usually rests in the region of the first primary molar. Next we have our Bown's nodules. These are remnants of salivary gland epithelium and are usually found in the buccal and lingual aspects of the ridge away from the midline. So here you can see the midline is here, and away from the midline you can see lots of nodules or lesions. This is a result of your salivary gland epithelium getting incorporated. So for all of these lesions there is no treatment necessary, as all these cysts and lesions, they disappear during the first 3 months of life. So if any patients or parents come with the worry of these lesions appearing in their newborn child, we can tell them like these lesions will disappear within the first 3 months of life, so there is no need to worry. Moving on to the second topic of lesions of erupting dentition. So these include eruption complications like eruption cyst, eruption hematoma, natal and neonatal teeth. So these are the lesions which occur throughout childhood in association with eruption of both the deciduous and the permanent teeth. So they may include small intraoral hemangiomas in the buccal mucosa and the alveolar ridge. These may appear in the infants, and they are usually disappear within the first few months of life. So an eruption cyst is a common lesion which is found in the soft tissue of the alveolar ridge. So this is a soft tissue cyst resulting from separation of the dental follicle from the crown of the erupting tooth. So it is usually associated with natal teeth of a newborn infant, and is also occurs in association with the eruption of deciduous and permanent teeth. So they appear as clear or blood tinged fluid filled masses on the crest of the alveolar ridge. So here you can see the eruption cyst in this picture. It is appearing as a blood filled lesion in the alveolar ridge. So these eruption cysts, they usually interfere with the feeding, or it may also bleed intermittently when they are traumatized, but it is usually asymptomatic. So these lesions, they usually disappear within a few months after the tooth erupts into the oral cavity. So in cases of any symptoms like pain, it should be unroofed and drained, or if the lesion bleeds and the natal tooth is removed. Simple incision or a partial excision of overlying tissue to expose the crown and drain the fluid is indicated when the underlying tooth is not erupting or the cyst is enlarging. So in case that the underlying tooth is not erupted even after the preferred time, that is, for example, permanent first incisor, it is supposed to erupt by 6 to 7 years of life, and even after 9 years it is not erupting, but the adjacent teeth have all erupted, we should take a radiograph to confirm the position of the tooth, and in case that the tooth is not erupting only because of the cyst, then it should be a simple incision or an excision is done to expose the underlying tooth. Moving on to the next topic of neonatal and natal teeth. So with the term we can tell that natal are teeth which are present at birth, and neonatal are teeth which are present after birth, that is within the period of 30 days after birth. If the teeth erupt, they are called as neonatal teeth. So here in this picture we can see a neonatal teeth, and in this case this is a premature eruption of a mandibular incisor. So this teeth is usually preferred to retain such teeth. So in case of management of these teeth, it is depending on the symptoms. Okay, so basically if the mother has any symptoms of pain when they are breastfeeding the child, then the teeth should be addressed. So if there is a traumatization of the nipple of the mother, or if the ventral surface of the tongue of the baby is traumatized, then the tooth is indicated for extraction. So if the tooth is not too mobile, then it is indicated for to be retained, so it can become firm with time and as the root continues to develop. If the tooth is excessively mobile because of the theoretical risk of aspiration by the young child, it is electively removed. So if the tooth removal is indicated, care should be taken to remove the entire tissue of the tooth, as sometimes only the crown may be removed, leaving behind the pulpal tissue, in which case the root may continue to develop and the root will be required to be removed at a later period of time. So in case of permanent teeth, it will be usually unaffected when you are removing a natal or neonatal teeth. So when removing these teeth, we should always protect the airways so that accidental aspiration of the tooth is prevented, and this can be done by placing a gauze over the backside of the mouth. A pair of Spencerville's forceps, as given in the figure here, can be used to get a firm grip of the natal or neonatal teeth to be extracted, and it can be removed in one piece. And medical history of the patient should be checked for any significant jaundice which may predispose for post-operative bleeding. Moving on to the next topic of abscess. So what is an abscess? An abscess is a non-specific inflammatory response to the presence of bacteria in normally sterile tissues. So it is a localized purulent form of apical periodontitis. So it is characterized by fluctuant buccal or palatal swelling with or without a draining fistula. Regional adenopathy is usually present in these children on the affected sites, and if the pus is draining, the lesion is usually asymptomatic. So coming to the treatment of abscess, it is usually by incision and drainage of the fluctuant area, and definitive therapy for that infected tooth is pulpectomy or extraction of the offended teeth, followed by a placement of any space maintainer, and a proper antibiotic therapy should be followed so that the infection is subsided. Moving on to the next topic of eruption gingivitis. This is a transitionary type of gingivitis which is often observed in young children when primary or permanent tooth are erupting. So this is usually a localized lesion which is affecting only around the erupting tooth, and it is usually associated with a difficult eruption, and it usually subsides once the tooth completely erupts into the oral cavity. So here in the picture you can see a case of eruption gingivitis where the 6 is erupting, and you can see the gingiva which is on the tooth surface is red and edematous. So what is the incidence of this eruption gingivitis? So the greatest increase in incidence of gingivitis in children is often seen in 6 to 7-year-old age group when the permanent teeth first begins to erupt into the oral cavity. This inflammation is most commonly associated with the eruption of the first and second permanent molars, and the condition is quite painful. Coming to the causes of eruption gingivitis, this increase in gingivitis apparently occurs because the gingival margin receives no protection from the coronal contour of the tooth during the early stages of active eruption. During this stage, the food debris, the material alba, the bacterial plaque often collect around and beneath the free tissue of the erupting tooth. So what are all the clinical features of eruption gingivitis? So the clinical features include pain, redness of gingiva, swelling of the gingiva, bleeding on probing, anorexia and dysphagia because of the pain, and this usually heals after the complete eruption of the tooth. And in cases of molars, if pericoronitis develops, then a pus discharge is sometimes seen with an associated lymph node enlargement. So this eruption gingivitis is a precursor of pericoronitis, and if it is left untreated, it will develop into pericoronitis. So coming to the treatment of this eruption gingivitis, so mild eruption gingivitis requires no treatment other than improved oral hygiene, so that any food accumulation or debris accumulation in that region is rinsed away. Painful eruption gingivitis is managed by oral hygiene. Instructions along with systemic analgesics like your NSAIDs can be given, and the condition may be helped by usage of an irrigant such as Paroxyl. Pericoronitis is the advanced stage of eruption gingivitis which has developed when the patient has failed to take proper oral hygiene measures during the eruption gingivitis stage. So pericoronitis is defined as the inflammation of the oral soft tissues surrounding the crown of partially erupted teeth. The major causes food and debris impaction and microbial flora that develops in the distally present pseudopocket. The gingiva appears red, swollen, and it is a separating lesion that is exclusively tender, with the pain which radiates towards the ear, throat and floor of the mouth. So this condition is also often associated with fever and lymph node enlargement, and cellulitis and trismus can sometimes occur in rare cases. So coming to the complications of pericoronitis, a pericoronitis lesion, if it is left untreated, it can develop into a pericoronal abscess, and it can also spread posteriorly into the oropharyngeal region. It can also lead to dysphagia because of the pain, and involvement of the lymph nodes is both in the posterior and the cervical region, and there might be a development of peritonsillar abscess and Ludwig's angina. So the treatment for the pericoronitis is operculectomy. So operculectomy is a condition, is a procedure which is usually contraindicated in cases of acute conditions. Acute condition is eliminated by proper NSAID provision, that is, for example, acetaminophen or ibuprofen can be given, and systemic antibiotics like penicillin, erythromycin, cephalosporins can be given to reduce the fever and lymph node enlargements, and also the patient should be given proper oral hygiene instructions for them to follow. So the operculectomy is done in cases of this pericoronitis, and the scaling of the gingival pocket is done to remove all the plaque as well as the infection and pus after removing the operculum using a scalpel blade number 11. So here from the diagram you can see that this is a pericoronitis that has developed over the erupting tooth. So this inflamed lesion is cut off from the base, and the region is irrigated with a hydrogen peroxide, that is a 3% solution, and a saline, that is a 0.9% solution, and the patient is asked to continue with the prescribed antibiotics for 3 more days and then rinse regularly with warm saline. The patient is asked to report after 3 days for the re-evaluation of the site. Moving on to mucocele. An oral mucocele is a cavity of mucus that develops in association with the salivary glands. So this is a lesion that occurs mainly due to trauma to the lower lip, and this can be a retention cyst or an extravasation cyst depending on the etiological factors and the condition of the salivary gland duct. So this is the most common benign salivary gland problem that is seen in childhood, because trauma is more commonly seen in children who are very active and fall down more often. So this lesion is a pseudocyst and doesn't have an epithelial lining if it is an extravasation type. So in this diagram we can see an extravasation type where due to the trauma, the duct of the minor salivary gland has broken off and the salivary gland exudate is filling the interstitial region, and this region, once it gets filled with the saliva, it becomes the mucocele of the extravasation type. So as said earlier, the etiological factor is mainly due to trauma, and this mucocele is a common lesion in children and adolescents resulting from rupture of the minor salivary glands excretory duct with the subsequent leakage of the mucin into the surrounding connective tissue that is later then surrounded with a fibrous capsule, that is the extravasation type. In case that the duct is partially or totally obstructed due to the trauma, there is accumulation of saliva behind the obstruction, and this is a retention cyst. Since this accumulation of mucus is surrounded by an epithelium of the already existing minor salivary glands, it is a true cyst. Moving on to the clinical features of a mucocele. When you view a mucocele clinically, you can see that it is a well circumscribed bluish translucent fluctuant swelling that is firm on palpation. Its color, it ranges from normal to whitish keratinized surface, and mucoceles are most frequently seen in the lower lip, usually lateral to the midline. Here you can see that it is present in the lower lip, thus just lateral to the midline of the lower lip. Mucoceles can also be found in the buccal mucosa, ventral surface of the tongue, retromolar region and the floor of the mouth where there are numerous minor salivary glands. And superficial mucoceles are usually short-lived, and the lesions burst spontaneously, leaving shallow ulcerations as shown in the picture which heal within a few days. However, many lesions require treatment to minimize the risk of recurrence. Moving on to the removal of the mucocele, the size of the mucocele determines the technique in which the mucocele is removed from the cheek, lip or palate. So in case of large mucoceles, unroofing is the treatment of choice, whereas dissection or enucleation is the appropriate treatment for moderately sized mucoceles. So a mucocele is excised in an elliptical fashion where the dissection is continued on a plane adjacent to the capsule down to the muscular layer, and all of the marginal glands and associated gland tissue is also removed before the primary closure. This is done because when a trauma occurs in the lower lip, not only the affected glands which are exhibited as a mucocele should be removed, the adjacent gland which are also traumatized should be removed, so that the recurrence of other mucocele lesions over a period of time is prevented. So here we can see some pictures showing the removal of a mucocele. So here in the first picture we can see a mucocele which is present in the lower lip. Once it is isolated, the lower lip is held in place by using a gauze to get a firm grip of the lower lip. So once a grip is received, we use a number 11 scalpel blade to place an incision, and once the incision is placed, the tissue is excised with a scalpel, and once the excision is done and finished, a suture is placed in the lesion. So after a period of 7 days, this the lesion, it approximates with each other and the removal of the suture can be done. So as said earlier, recurrence is a more common complication of mucocele, as the trauma to the lower lip is not only localized to that few minor salivary glands, and the adjacent salivary glands are also affected. So excision of the lower lip may also be harmful to the labial branches of the mental nerve. So we should take very much care in case of excision of larger or moderately sized mucoceles. Moving on to ranula. So ranula is nothing but a mucocele which is present in the floor of the mouth. So the name ranula is derived from the Latin word ranula pippins, which means frog. This is due to the fact that the elevation of the tongue by a fluid filled pseudocyst represents or it resembles the appearance of a frog's tongue as seen in the picture. So here is the ranula which is present in the floor of the mouth, which is similar to the frog here. So the clinical features of ranula are that it appears in infants and toddlers. Most commonly it is congenital, and it is a result of dilatation of the sublingual and submaxillary gland ducts in the floor of the mouth, whereas those appear in older children are usually traumatic. So ranulas are characteristically located in the sublingual space between the mylohyoid muscle and the lingual mucosa. So they are occasionally they may extend into the submental or submandibular spaces, and they perforate through the mylohyoid muscle, and these ranulas are also called as plunging ranulas. So coming to the technique of removal of the ranulas, so small ranulas as per mucoceles it can be excised. However, larger ones should be observed for several months so that the sufficient amount of lining is formed and matures before it undergoes any treatment. So plunging ranula often requires excision of the salivary gland to prevent recurrence. So here we see the flow chart which depicts the removal of a ranula. So once the sufficient amount of fibrous lining is formed, the roof of the pseudocyst is unroofed. Okay. So once the unroofing is done, the cavity is drained of all the fluid that is present in the cavity, and the mature lining is identified and sutured along the raw edges of the mucosa as given in this picture. So once the cavity floor is explored and the extent of the lesion is found out, it is packed full of gauze so that a foreign body reaction is induced by the host body. So this is done so that a fibrous tissue is formed which seals off all the leak from the associated acini which caused the ranula, and the associated acini eventually it becomes atropic. An important process during the process of marsupialization is that the submandibular duct is identified and cannulated so as to prevent any salivary contamination there. When the lesion is marsupialized, to allow free drainage and to avoid damage to the submandibular ducts, sublingual glands, blood vessels, nerves in the floor of the mouth. Moving on to the next topic of odontogenic cyst. This odontogenic cyst in children is mostly associated with impacted teeth such as dentigerous cyst. Canines are most frequently involved in cases of children rather than third molars. In the late mixed and early permanent dentition period, dentigerous cyst is associated with impacted premolars and second permanent molars, and in cases of teenagers the dentigerous cyst is mostly involving the impacted third molars. So a lateral and periodontal cyst and a residual cyst are also there, but it is more rare in childhood. So odontogenic cysts are usually asymptomatic and is usually discovered when a permanent tooth has failed to erupt on time. So during that time we take an IOPA and see why the tooth has not yet erupted into the oral cavity. So during routine OPGs or IOPAs we find this odontogenic cyst. So in the radiograph the cyst appear as a radiolucent area outlined by a thin radiopaque line. So to avoid missing a cyst with a deeply impacted tooth, a panoramic X-ray, that is an OPG, is most useful. So the treatment for the odontogenic cyst is marsupialization. Marsupialization is the treatment of choice for large cysts, as its removal may cause pathological fracture or devitalize the adjacent tooth. If we remove the cyst by enucleation in this stage, if a large cyst has been removed as such, it may lead to weakening of the bone there, and fracture may tend to happen more easily. So the procedure basically involves removal of a part of the lining and to establish a drainage, and then the lesion reepithelializes after formation of granulation tissue and shrinks in size. The ribbon gauze is placed in the cavity and the cyst is then enucleated. Extra care is required on part of the patient to keep the cavity clean and prevent any infection. Coming to the cyst enucleation, so cyst enucleation is done by elevating the flap first. So diagrammatic representations have been given here. So once envelope flap has been raised so as to expose the site, reflection is done so that the sound bone has reached all around the proposed bony opening. So the area of interest should be completely exposed when you are removing the or elevating the flap. So often bone would be perforated by the expanding cysts, or just a thin layer of bone will be present in that region. So as far as possible, the cyst should be removed in one piece. So the cystic lining is separated from the bone, and the excess bone is removed to facilitate its removal. So the one which is used to separate the lining of the cyst from the bone is the biangle spoon excavator, which is given here. The adherence of the cyst to the neurovascular bundle or to the adjacent teeth should be checked before removing the cyst. After checking the vitality of the adjacent teeth, the need for apicectomy or root canal treatment should be evaluated. Moving on to an important topic, which is maxillary frenectomy. So when you are talking about maxillary frenectomy, we talk about the labial frenum in the maxilla. The superior labial frenum is a triangular fold of tissue that originates in the lip and it inserts into the attached gingiva in the maxillary midline. It is a remnant of embryonal structures, that is the tectolabial folds, and the frenectomy is the complete excision of the frenum, whereas the term frenotomy indicates partial removal of the frenum. That is, instead of partial removal, it is more of a relocation of the frenum. The maxillary frenum, it is supposed to apically relocate during the normal growth, but an abnormal frenum attachment may be seen between the central incisors if this migration fails. So the clinical features of a prominent maxillary frenum in children, although a common finding, is often a concern, and especially it is associated with the midline diastema. So interference with the oral hygiene measures, aesthetics, psychological reasons are contributing factors that relate to treatment of the maxillary frenum. So diagnosis of a frenum, it can be done by clinical examination of the site. An abnormal frenum will appear excessively wide and or are attached especially close to the gingival margin. So a lack of apparent zone of attached gingiva along the midline may be observed, and the stretching of the lip may produce a blanching or ischemia in that region of the interdental papilla or the palatal tissues, which is an important indicator that there is a requirement of frenectomy. So when the hypertrophic frenum is associated with an incomplete fusion of the intermaxillary suture, the contour of the alveolar process between the central incisors becomes W-shaped or irregular ovoid shape rather than the normal V shape. So what are all the indications for removal of a maxillary frenum? So the main indication for removal of the frenum is if the frenum restricts the lip movement, and a frenal attachment also prevents the closure of the midline diastema when during an orthodontic movement. So in case where the frenum attachment prevents mechanical tooth cleansing, a frenectomy should be considered. So when you are removing a frenum, a timing of removal is very important. So this can be done in two different categories. So the timing is dependent upon the indications for the removal. So in cases where the maxillary midline diastema is present, different options for timing is there. So the first option is initial diastema closure by orthodontic treatment, followed by removal of the frenum and placement of retention appliances. Then the wound contraction will contribute to the retention of the orthodontic treatment result. The second option is to remove the frenum before the end of active orthodontic treatment. This is performed when the frenum may inhibit the orthodontic closure of the midline diastema. In both these cases, the removal is usually done after the eruption of permanent canines and lateral incisors. The technique of removal or the frenectomy is usually by two procedures. One is the simple frenectomy and another one is the Z-plasty. So coming on to the simple frenectomy, an incision is made across the base of the frenum at its attachment to the incisive papilla. So here is the incisive papilla, there an incision is placed and the dissection is carried down to the periosteum and then extended on both sides of the frenum to its attachment to the labial mucosa. So from the incisive papilla, on both sides of the frenum, follow the dotted lines, we will be making an incision till the attachment in the labial mucosa. So once the frenum is excised, there will be a bell-shaped defect as shown in this picture. So we can see both the diagrammatic representation as well as the clinical picture here. So there will be a bell-shaped defect in which the edges are undermined and labial flaps are then approximated with each other and closed with the 5.0 chromic catgut sutures. So if there is a diamond shaped defect on removal of the frenum, will be allowing the tissues to heal through secondary intention. Next is the Z-plasty. So Z-plasty involves excision of the frenum and making two oblique incisions down the periosteum, and the resultant triangular flaps are raised and sutured with interrupted sutures in a reverse position. So once the frenum is removed in Z-plasty, we will be making two triangular incisions, in which the triangular incision in the anterior region is placed posteriorly and the one which is present posterior is repositioned anteriorly, and they are sutured using a interrupted sutures. Moving on to the next more commonly seen topic, that is ankyloglossia. So ankyloglossia is also called as tongue tie, and it is a developmental anomaly of the tongue characterized by a prominent lingual frenum that is attached high on the lingual alveolar ridge, and the thick lingual frenum results in limitation of the tongue movement, that is a partial ankyloglossia, or the tongue becoming totally fused to the floor of the mouth, that is total ankyloglossia. So here in the picture we can see a partially ankyloglossia condition where there is a short lingual frenum and the movement of the tongue is restricted. So the reported prevalence of this condition is 0.1 to 10.7% of the whole population. So how do you diagnose this condition? So the clinical observation as well as the history which the patient tells you will be sufficient to diagnose this condition. So the frenum is often abnormally short and thick, and it will be decreasing the mobility of the tongue. So if the patient is asked to protrude the tongue, there will be a heart-shaped defect, that is as shown in the previous picture, that is seen here. That is the heart-shaped defect that is seen here. So what are all the clinical features of your ankyloglossia? So there is a higher prevalence of nipple pain in mothers feeding infants with ankyloglossia when compared to mothers feeding infants without ankyloglossia. So there are some difficulties in articulation of specific words and syllables. For example, rolling the R or producing sounds like sh, ich and all, which we have the tongue to be positioned against the palate and vibrate against the palate. It is very difficult for children with ankyloglossia to produce these sounds. Other problems related to reduced tongue mobility may be discomfort, difficulties with licking the lips when the patient is experiencing dry lips, and keeping the teeth clean. And also because of the intense pulling, ankyloglossia is also associated with gingival recessions. And it has been hypothesized that the tongue which is fixed in a low position in cases of ankyloglossia may predispose the maxilla for hypodevelopment and mandible for prognathism, which is a typical condition of class 3 malocclusion, and that they are hypothesized that ankyloglossia is a predisposing factor for this malocclusion. Frenal attachment may interfere with denture stability and dislodging of denture when the tongue is raised. So ankyloglossia in children can be treated in two different methods. So one is your frenotomy, another one is frenectomy. So frenotomy is done in children younger than 1 year of age, as it doesn't cause that much of discomfort. So the tongue is first held in place by use of a gauze piece as shown in this picture. So once the tongue is held in place, you are releasing the frenum by giving small one or several cuts using a straight scissors. The cut should be done onto the uppermost free part of the frenum, that is this area. So that is the one which is attached to the tongue. So the cut is started from the area which is attached to the tongue, and it is extended posteriorly such that until the mobility that you require is attained. So during this procedure you can use hemostats to achieve hemostasis. Frenectomy is done in older children where the cuts are placed from the alveolar ridge. So parallel incisions are placed along the frenum and the band of tissue is removed, and relieving incisions are made at the junction of the floor of the mouth and the surface of the tongue. Once the incision is completed, there will be a V-shaped lesion. Once this is stretched, the tongue is stretched, it will appear like this, and it will form a V-shaped opening, which is then sutured in a Y fashion using interrupted sutures. Moving on to the last topic of this seminar, this is apicoectomy. So apicoectomy is the term used for surgery involving root apex to treat apical infection. So it is the removal of the apical portion of the root and curettage of periapical necrotic, granulomatous, inflammatory and cystic lesions that are usually not responding to any other treatment. So what are all the indications for apicoectomy? So apico is the apex of the tooth and ectomy is the removal of the apex. So apicoectomy is indicated in cases of apical anomaly of the root apex, that is intracanal calcifications, dilacerations and open apex. In cases of root with broken fillings or overfillings, in cases of any fracture of the apical third of the root, we can remove the apical portion of the root alone. In cases of formation of periapical granuloma cyst which is not responding to antibiotic or prophylactic treatments, in case of draining sinus tract which is non-responsive to root canal treatments, and in cases of extension of root canal sealants or cement beyond the apex. So this procedure is usually contraindicated in presence of systemic diseases. In cases of teeth with deep periodontal pockets and grade 3 mobility, it is contraindicated when traumatic occlusion cannot be corrected, and in cases of acute infections which are non-responsive to the treatment. Moving on to the procedure of epicavectomy, asepsis and isolation is done to that region, and infiltration local anesthesia is placed, and the flap is raised according to the site of the infection. So in this case, we can see that there is a semilunar incision that is placed in relation to 2-1, so that the lesion is present in the apical region of 2-1 is addressed. So once the semilunar incision is placed as per given in the diagram is placed in the patient, a flap is raised so that the bone is exposed. So once the bone is exposed, we are using a bone burr with copious amount of saline irrigation to make a window in that region so that the lesion is exposed. Once the exposed lesion is visible and the window of the bone cut is sufficient to remove the lesion, we are using a bone curette or spoon excavators to remove the lesion that is present, like your granulomatous tissue, cyst, or broken root filling or broken instruments. Whatever is present in that region is removed through this window. Once that is done, and if in case of a root canal treated tooth, the exposed GP is melted using a heated instrument. Once that is done, the flaps are repositioned and approximated and sutures are given. I would like to conclude by saying that an understanding of the principles of the minor oral surgical techniques and the potential to prevent problems by early diagnosis are fundamentally important in treating pediatric patients, and we as periodontists and also general dentists need to be knowledgeable about the standard as well as the latest surgical techniques that allows us to handle these children better. So in case anyone wants to go through the topics that has been discussed today in even more detail, you can go through these references. Thank you for your time. I end my session.